Last week, after the victory over Hull City, Mourinho, the Chelsea manager, claimed that his team has 90% chance to win the league championship this season. Now, Chelsea leads the second place Manchester City with 6 points and play one less game than Manchester City. We can say that Manchester City has a small chance to win the championship this season, but if they can win all the way down to the end of this season, which are 8 games total, they can still remain their hope for championship. This time, we are going to estimate their chance to challenge Chelsea in the rest of this season. First of all, let us look at the simple K-means clustering to view their recent performance. Based on Cato's grid test, we choose 7 clusters. In this case, let us take a look at the visualization of clustering assignment. First of all, let us look at the simple K-means clustering to view their recent performance. Based on Cato's grid test, we choose 7 clusters. In this case, let us take a look at the visualization of clustering assignment. And here is the partial result of each cluster centroid. As we can see in the cluster centroids, none of the centroid has a negative result, which indicates that the team is not likely to lose in any situation. As we can see in the partial result, the clustering with the worst result are cluster 0, cluster 4, and cluster 5. In this next step, we run the multi-factor ANOVA based on the formula between the game results and cluster assignment, and here is the result. We can see in the result above that the p-value of cluster 0 intercept, cluster 4, and cluster 5 are small, which means that statistically, these so-called bad games of Manchester City happens randomly. And these bad games would not last long and affect the team consistently for the game results. However, we did the same test on the formula between the goal scored and the cluster assignment and got really different results. We can see that cluster 0 is radically different from the other 2 clusters. Manchester City in cluster 0 tends to score much more goals than they do in other 2 clusters. Also, we can see that even though the p-value of cluster 4 and cluster 5 are still larger than the average, but the difference is not as significant as we see in the one with game results. Therefore, we run the same test on the formula between the goal being scored and the cluster assignment to see what happened on the defense side. We can see in the result above, the p-value of cluster 0 and cluster 5 are large enough to convince us that it will make change. We can see that even though the team played relatively badly, they can balance themselves between offense and defense. As a sophisticated team, the problem would just exist temporarily in 1 or 2 games, and that is the reason why we held this. Let's take a look at the cluster assignment again. Neither cluster 0 nor cluster 5 took place in row. However, we need to know that the home attribute of cluster 0 and cluster 5 are 0, which means that the team plays badly in their away games. And in fact, for games in cluster 0, the last 3 games actually happened in row of away games, as another cluster 6 of away game, which the team performed well, is confirmed with a large p-value as we see above. However, all of the games in cluster 6 locate in the beginning of the season, so it proves that the team is able to perform well in away game, but does not prove the team to be able to perform regularly as they did in the beginning of the season. To prove whether the cluster 0 can last in row or not, we did some simulation where the 3 home games locate within the last 3 games of cluster 0. In this simulation, we would assume that the 3 games took place in a away field and see if they would move to cluster 0. Here is the new clustering assignment. We can see that in the new assignment, 2 games of cluster 0 happen in row, and the 3 games are equally distributed from cluster 2 and cluster 3 to cluster 0, cluster 5, and cluster 6. Therefore, we can see that the problem of game does not last long. As we can see in the new assignment, the recent 2 games located in cluster 2 and cluster 5, which is an improvement compared to the previous game, we can be sure that the team will play rather strongly in the coming future and resolve the problem within the team. We can guarantee Manchester City will make a comeback and defend the championship, but we can be sure that the competition is going to be fierce and far from over, as Maureen has said in the press. Chelsea has 90% chance to get the championship.